Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, people of all ages, colors, and creeds, welcome back to the Investigative Journal. Greatest show on earth. Greg Anthony here, and I'm not exaggerating. And the reason I'm not exaggerating is because we cover things that the mainstream media and most of the alternative media runs for the hills when they hear this subject. They don't want to hear it, and the reason is because they're controlled by the very people we talk about. That's the same reason that you're never going to get the truth on the Jeffrey Epstein pedophile story. He was killed in jail, covering up for people like Clinton and Prince Andrew and the rest of them. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But anyway, there's a lot of things we can talk about today. But I wanted to go back to the roots of this show. And the roots are this. How do we ever in the hell find out about the Jesuits and the Vatican and all of this stuff that never goes uncovered? And why would we even want to tackle this subject? Well, when I was younger, when I was a little bit more naive, when I basically didn't know shit from Shinola, I started looking into this story, not knowing where it would lead. And it started when I lived in Rome as a struggling journalist trying to write a story here and there, trying to understand the world at a very young age. And I ran across this huge Vatican bank scandal. And I ran across things that I just would sit there after a hard day of trying to get work done, researching stories and what have you, sitting there having a glass of wine going, my God, this can't be true. But my God, it was true. At least the facts lead us to that. You know, it's kind of like, understanding how to research. And what I'm saying is you're going to run into a lot of stumbling blocks. You're going to run into a lot of people who give you conflicting stories. But all in all, when you put everything together, this story makes a lot of sense. And I remember back when I started talking about this story in the United States, when I came back from Rome, and I was up against a bunch of people who basically were in the alternative media and didn't want to touch it. And basically called me crazy, tried to discredit me, which is a thing that they do once you get onto this subject. And what that told me was I was leading in the right direction, at least in the right direction of what we were talking about. It didn't lead in the right direction for any kind of financial gain or any kind of show that would be viewed by a lot of people. But it was the right direction. And as I came back, there are a few pivotal points in this search for the truth and what I call the Jesuit-led New World Order. I think the first one, when I came back, was actually realizing I had to talk about it, because for a couple of years I just wanted to forget about everything I did in Italy, and I took on some different types of occupations. I decided I wanted to be a restaurant owner and did that. I did own a couple small newspapers, but didn't touch this story at all, because I guess it was kind of like I'm in shock. How could this be? Maybe it only is true in Rome. And when I got back to America, it was just all a bad dream. So I think the pivotal point in my life was when I decided that I had to do this again. I had to go back to the roots of this story and begin covering it. So a lot of the little things I was trying to do in my life took a second seat, so to speak. And during that period of time, I did spend my time profitably. I basically told you about those two little businesses. Ended up getting my law degree. But then again, I was pulled back into this story. And one of the things that pulled me back into it was 9/11. And that was an awakening. That was a turning point. So 9/11, getting back to the roots of this story in my life, were pivotal. Then, as I moved along, and I think this is important because you'll see how it really is basically, just something that, we're doing on a daily basis. And it's not something that we're just pulling out of the clear blue sky. So, armed with a little bit of information and experience with the Vatican from my time in Rome, I decided, and I ended up doing a radio show. And the radio show was on Republic Broadcasting Network in Genesis, and I happened to run across Alex Jones. And I think the second pivotal point was when I was covering this story daily. I got a lot of flack from the owner of Republic Broadcasting, who said I was a one-trick pony and had to not cover this story like I was. And then I got from Alex Jones back then, years ago, that he said he didn't touch the Vatican at all, and said that they were just a bunch of old priests and I was crazy. And he basically discredited me. And then again, not only him but others created this whole story that I was a CIA or Mossad agent, and they named some guy that was my military handler and other things. And in fact, when I was living in a small town in Colorado, I walked into the library and somebody in that town was reading on the internet Alex Jones talking about me, or someone from that genre. Okay, somebody that was close to Jones or whatever, saying this whole story about who I wasn't, but he believed it. And he looked at me and said, "Are you this guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And I tried to tell him my side of the story, but I think because Jones was bigger, had a lot more listeners, and basically look at him now, most people believed him. So that was another pivotal point. A pivotal point, basically saying, wow, I'm going in the right direction. So I continued, and I was no longer on those stations. And I found First Amendment Radio, this Christian station, and started doing the show back then. Another pivotal point was when I really started talking to Eric Phelps, who wrote Vatican Assassins. And I talked with him many times because he was very knowledgeable, knew many things I didn't know. And I had a chance to read his book, interviewed him on my show many times. And I have to say I was very encouraged because I could see all of the things that I saw in Rome firsthand going on in the 80s, now being blossomed out to what was going on even in, after 9/11, and what went on, ever since the Jesuits, we could start there, were formed in the 1500s as the military arm of the Vatican to suppress the Protestant Reformation. And Phelps was like a unbelievable wealth of knowledge. And I consider him, someone that I would refer to, talk to, etc. And said, God, there's a lot of people out here that know about the Vatican-led New World Order. That was a pivotal juncture, in my life. So I continued on and interviewed person after person, everybody I could find. And I have to say, I miss interviewing people and got quite good at it. If I could do anything, I can't I'm not a plumber, I'm not a carpenter, I can't do much, I can't build a house, but I sure can interview somebody. So everybody has their talents. But looking at the next pivotal juncture was this kind of cross-examination between Phelps and Tupper Saussy. Now, I, interviewed Tupper Saucy before he passed away. He wrote a couple major books. The one that I want to talk about today is Rulers of Evil, and it's all leading up to this. I haven't discussed this in a while, and it's a pivotal point in my life discussing this. topic and why I continued on. And as I met Tupper Saussy and interviewed him and read his book, I found out some missing links, I think, in this Vatican Jesuit story. And one of the things I was always curious about was the infiltration of America. When did it begin? And Tupper talked about it in ways and researched. He was a great researcher in ways that conflicted. So we got now a conflict here between Tupper Saussy and Eric Phelps. And what I found was let's look at two major differences. Tupper Saussy said, wait, George Washington and some of the founding fathers were in the hands of the Jesuits prior to the formation of America, and that through the efforts of a Jesuit general named Lorenzo Ricci, who was supposedly publicly and for public consumption, and to the wealth of information that Eric Phelps had, Phelps said that no, the Jesuits were disbanded by the Pope in the late 1700s, then resurrected again, and in the interim, Lorenzo Ricci was killed in prison, or died in prison. He was imprisoned by the Pope, and that Washington and the founding fathers were basically pure Protestants, had really very little to do with the Jesuit influence. Well, Tupper Saussy disagreed with that and stated that, wait a minute, there's a good possibility that the Vatican and the Jesuits were never really at odds with one another privately, because one needed the other like a hand in a glove, like a good cop and a bad cop. And he said, no, this idea that the Jesuits were disbanded for public consumption was true. They wanted the word out there, but really behind the scenes they were stronger than ever. And his logic was this, that in the New World, the Protestants were frightened to death, of having Jesuits in the Vatican come there because they knew what they had done already in Europe. Makes sense. So he said what they did was basically the typical Sun Tzu art of war. Let your enemy think you're weak or non-existent, and when your enemy lays down his guard, you can get more accomplished than if you went up against him in a full-fledged fight. So he said, no, what really happened here was there's a good possibility that Lorenzo Ricci never died in prison in Rome. And basically then there was information that a man came over like Lorenzo Ricci, called the Professor, that was instrumental in working with Franklin and a number of the founding fathers. And there's documented evidence that that's a very good possibility. And so we have this kind of idea differing here. So my question was, after the America was founded, and in 1820 the Jesuits were reestablished magically, right? How come? What happened here? So what Saussy was saying made a lot of sense, right? So here I am. I'm interviewing Eric, who I really liked. I loved all his information. And I'm interviewing Tupper, and they have a disagreement in a major area of concern regarding the United States, the Jesuits, and the formation of this country. And so what happened was, I started looking back at what Eric said. He called Tupper Saussy a Jesuit coadjutor, that Tupper Saussy was a shill working for the Jesuits, and all this stuff could not be true. And I started to think, why? I mean, look, he had facts that were out there, that Ricci died, the Vatican was instrumental in disbanding the Jesuits, then the Jesuits were reestablished in 1820. Saussy took a different approach, but basically the facts were, what his argument was, had made a lot of sense. And I could not understand why Phelps came after him so hard, and so I was conflicted. And this was a major point in my studies of the Jesuits and what goes on here in America. So a number of other things came out regarding Eric Phelps, and many people now consider him to be the Jesuit coadjutor. And I was in the middle of these two guys, like both of them, but I had to think this way. Why would Phelps come out so hard against Saussy? Saussy never came back and said Eric was a Jesuit coadjutor. No. And I read some of the emails and some of the correspondence, and it just didn't make sense to me. And I think what was going on was someone wanted that story to go away. And since Eric was kind of the anointed head of the anti-Jesuit faction, he was in perfect position to do that. So it led a little bit of suspicion on my part that maybe he was on the other side. And I can't say that with 100% or even with probable information that he is, outside of several other little things that he does. I mean, he pushes white supremacy. The Bible stating certain things about the whites should live in one state, blacks in another, which to me causes chaos and conflict, of course, and doesn't make much sense. And another interesting thing was his book, Vatican Assassins, and I'm not criticizing it, a lot of information came out, I think in 2001, right around that time, and his first interviews were with a magazine or a group called the Spectator or the American Free Press. A group of people out of Washington that basically, American Free Press I used to work for and wrote articles for, found out they were basically a little bit shady and on the other side, probably Jesuit controlled. And their predecessor before that was the Spotlight. And that's where he got his first interviews. And then some people did some research, could not find out where he got his book published. And so there were a few questions about him, but I'm not going to get into whether he is or he is not a Jesuit shill, and whether Saussy is or isn't. But I will say this, I interviewed both of them, and I can not understand. Both of their theories make sense, and there are people who don't follow what Saussy says about the American Revolution, that basically Lorenzo Ricci, he called it Lorenzo Ricci's war. And I kind of, when you read some of the facts he came up with, I kind of said to myself, man, it makes a lot of sense. And then when you got the information that Ricci was maybe actually in America dealing, call him one of our founding fathers, then you start saying, this makes really too much sense. Then in the background, you start saying, guess who were the first to translate Sun Tzu's Art of War? The Jesuit in France. He was involved in that as well. And the idea of that, then you start understanding who really wrote Sun Tzu's Art of War, because if you go back to China, it's pretty hard to pinpoint who it was. Jesuits were in China in the 16th century, very early on. So there's a lot of speculation. I think a lot of things need to be looked at. So that was another turning point in my quest to find out the truth. And as that passed, I started to wonder more about, wow, how much control do these people have? And how many do they actually, we know it's called controlled opposition, but how many of these guys out there who purport to be giving you solid information why the Jesuits and the Vatican rule and why they should be considered very big kingpins in the New World Order, you start wondering how many of them out there are really placed there to find out basically who really is interviewing and finding out things about them, because they really do not want this story out there. They really don't. I mean, if this story got to be listened to by millions, they would be in trouble. And so they got to limit though they have to really make sure it doesn't get out big time. And if it did, it would mean a big setback. So they have to have control of both the mainstream and the alternative news. So it started to make me wonder, how far could we really go? So ever since that happened, I decided it was more difficult. I used to do interviews all the time with people. And that was really before the internet got to be as big as it is. What I mean by that, everybody now that I interview has their own YouTube show. And so I started to think to myself, all those hours I spent, was it really worth it? Who were these people? And I started to say, well, I'm going to do a show where I limit my interviews. My interviewing days are over. And perhaps I'll refer to the other people out there on YouTube and look up what they're doing. Still research, but change the format. So the show evolved into this. And the reason was basically that information and that counter information by Saussy and then Phelps and all that stuff blossoming into this idea that who's who. So, personally, I wanted to talk about Tupper Saussy and some of his work. Good researcher. And he handled the Phelps situation with a little bit more class and did not make statements that were unproven and basically more or less statements of an inquisitor. You are a Jesuit shill because you had researched the fact that we just talked about the differences between the Vatican and the Jesuits and the disbanding of the Jesuits and their role in the American Revolution, Washington's role. I remember Eric got really mad at me when I started finding information that Washington really had solid connections to the Roman Catholic faith, and basically on his deathbed became either a Catholic or was given the rights by a Catholic priest. There was a lot of information regarding his connections to Freemasonry, the Jesuits, etc., that Phelps did not like and said I was, off base. That was not true. So there were some disagreements. Let's leave it at that. So anyway, looking back at Tupper Saussy, I have his book in front of me, Rulers of Evil, and there was a time when I went through this book and a lot of his information on shows, bringing on guests, talking about it, and I wanted to go back. I found an article by John Rappaport. You may know him out there. He presents, you can go to his website. It's called, I think it's shiftfrequency.com, and he's got a page here about Saussy that I want to read what he said about Tupper, and then I want to pull out a chapter that has a little bit to do with the Bible and his idea of the mark of Cain and how he relates this to the leaders of the world today. And I thought it quite interesting. His book is filled with a lot of historical information, and he ends it with a couple chapters called The Mark of Cain, The Two Ministries, etc., with a little Bible. He was a Bible believer, very strongly believed in the Bible when he wrote, and wanted to bring that to you. So stick around. We'll be back in, I think, 3 minutes, if God willing, and the crick does not rise. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, the Jesuit command called and said, okay, we'll let you do another show, as you heard my promo there. They do not, the Supreme Command does not want you to listen to this stuff. So what happened? Well, the creek didn't rise in those 3 minutes, and God is still willing to let me go on. So we're going to do another half hour. Before I get back to Tupper Saussy, I did want to mention yesterday's show. I'm going to continue that interview in the book called the Arco Volume, where this pastor in the 1800s went to Rome, supposedly got in the Vatican archives and pulled out things about the Roman investigation into the young boy Jesus, and sent out an investigator named Gamaliel, and could not find Jesus. But he did talk to a number of his acquaintances, as well as Jesus, as well as Mary and Joseph. So we're going to do that, and I'm going to get to that either later this week. So I didn't forget about it, because I did receive a number of emails on that, and some were good, some were bad. I'll talk about that another time. Another thing I was going to do today, but I want to do again, because I just had my satellite, I put that in quotes, TV put in, okay? And every time they do, I ask them, where are you pointing that thing? And they go, well, there's a tower over there. I go, well, I thought it was a satellite. And, well, anyway, I'm going to make a statement. And now I'm going to get so much crap over this, but we're going to do a show on why satellites don't exist. And also, you've heard of Elon Musk and that whole rocket ship thing he's doing, how basically that's kind of like the... it's an offshoot of NASA. You know, they're all BSing you, so to speak. And it's really crazy because as far as I'm concerned, none of that stuff exists. So it's all science fiction. Can we prove it? Absolutely not. Is there credible information that what I'm saying could be true? Yes. So we're going to go at it from that point of view. Okay, no satellites. Every time, ask your satellite guy when he comes over, and I don't get in, I say, how, it's not a satellite company. He goes, I don't know what it is. All I'm doing is putting it up and getting paid. And I said, good, all I'm doing is listening to baseball and occasional news shows that I have to listen to. So, anyway, let's move on. Okay, Tupper-Saucy, the article by John Rappaport. Well, it's not really an article. He put a page up regarding the Jesuits and Tupper-Saucy. And he says, my late friend, this is John Rappaport speaking, Tupper-Saucy wrote a shocking book titled Rulers of Evil. It was published in 2001. It's about the Jesuits. It's about their influence on the founding of the United States. Tupper was a brilliant researcher among his other talents. While making his case in the book, he lets the reader know when the points of reference are circumstantial. Tupper was a man who knew how to assess degrees of evidence. One of the most shocking facts, I find this interesting, about the highly controversial book was its publication by HarperCollins, a major house. That feat was somehow accomplished by agent Peter Fleming. Peter did what no other agent could have done. He pulled off a magic trick for the ages. I'm sure once the book was in print, the people at Harper looked at each other and said, what did we just do? How did this happen? Peter Fleming must have hypnotized us. I offer a group of quotes from the book, transcribed at truthcontrol.com without comment. The quotes are meant to attract your interest, so you'll find a copy of Rulers of Evil and read it. These statements involve the Jesuits, the Knights Templar, the Vatican, and the Freemasons. And he says this quote, during the night of December 16th, 1773, a gang of Indians climbed aboard a certain ship in the Boston harbor, ripped open 342 of the East India Company's tea chests, and threw them overboard, their contents valued at $90,000. Well, they looked like Indians, and witnesses thought they were Indians, but the big open secret was that they were Freemasons in disguise. Perhaps the most succinct statement was on the subject appears in respected Masonic historian Arthur Edward Waite's New Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, when he says, the Boston Tea Party was entirely Masonic, carried out by members of the St. John's Lodge during an adjourned meeting. The East India Company was a major subsidizer of the Jesuit mission to Beijing. So look at the connection to China already. And guess what's happening in China? This is me speaking, little old me. Look at what happened in China. I mean, they used Russia. Now they're using China. Now, I mean, the whole thing's going to be one world government anyway, one world order. And so we're seeing, I mean, is it really a coincidence that America sold out to China years ago? Oh, God. The Jesuits, let's get back to the quote, the Jesuits in turn interceded with Oriental monarchs to secure lucrative commercial favors for the company, including monopolies on tea, spices, saltpeter for explosives, silks, and the world's opium trade. Indeed, the company appears to owe its very existence to the Society of Jesus. No kidding. Freemasonry, quote, wasn't the natural, the reasonable, the only intelligent way for the Roman Catholic Church to control A, the ongoing affront of Protestantism, B, the increase of divine right kings heading their own national churches independent of Vatican control, and C, the incredible explosion of international mercantilism. Like the aquatic creature whose mouth resembles a comfortable resting place to its prey, the Masonic lodges were a sagacious recycling of the old Templar infrastructure into a dynamic, spiritual, and economic brotherhood that gave Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, agnostics, and anyone else an opportunity to build a better life outside of Roman Catholicism, yet still under the Church's superintending eye. That statement, folks, is very revealing because, Freemasonry is interesting. If you go to certain places, and there's Freemasonry in Islam, in the Muslim countries, and there'll be a Quran on the altar. You go into one here, and you got the Bible, etc., etc. Quote, of the 2.5 million enumerated inhabitants in 1787. Okay, there were 2.5 million people here in 1787 in America. The Roman Catholic population consisted, guess what, of no more than 16,000 in Maryland, 7,000 in Pennsylvania, 1,500 in New York, and 200 in Virginia. So there weren't many Catholics here back then, folks. But once the Constitution was in place, remember what I said earlier? But once that was in place, the steady influx of European immigrants transformed Roman Catholicism from America's smallest to largest religious denomination. Whoop, magically. By 1850, the higher powers at Rome could view the United States as a viable tributary, if not another papal state. Quote, the highest master of a Masonic lodge received commandments from an unknown superior, a superior whose will the master's whole struggle up the degrees had trained him to obey without question. What the masters never realized was that this mysterious personage, as we shall examine in more detail later, was in fact none other than the Black Pope, the head of the Jesuits. Quote, then, as an addendum to its closing statements, the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, recommended that Jesuits should be given place over members of other orders as preachers and professors. It was at Trent that the Roman Catholic Church began marching to the beat of the Black Papacy, the Jesuits. Quote, fascism may be an ugly word to many, but its stately emblem is apparently offensive to no one. The emblem of fascism, a pair of them, commands the wall above and behind the speaker's rostrum in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, folks, that wasn't put there years ago. It's still sitting there if you want to go visit your capital. And ask yourself, why would it be there? These are the Roman symbols of fascism. They're called fascia. And I can't think of any reason for them to be there other than to declare the fascist nature of American Republican democracy. Yeah, tell the people one thing, do another. I mean, that's all the time that goes on in every walk of life. Every Jesuit in the world must realize that their hierarchy, and many of them at the lower levels don't, are full of shit. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, and are double-talking you to death. You know, a fascia is a Roman device. It shouldn't be in a place like the House of Representatives. Well, that's what and nothing gets done there now. I mean, you can see it. We talk about it all the time. Actually, it originated with the ancient Etruscans. And that's before Rome, from whom the earliest Romans derived their religious jurisprudence nearly 3,000 years ago. It's an axe head, whose handle is a bundle of rods, tightly strapped together by a red sinew. That's exactly what's there in the House of Representatives. And it symbolizes the ordering of priestly functions into a single infallible sovereign, an autocrat who could require life and limb of his subjects. If the fascia is entwined with laurel, like the pair on the House of Representatives wall, it signifies Caesarian military power. The Romans called this infallible sovereign Pontifex Maximus, supreme bridge builder. Quote, no building can rightly be called a capital unless it's a temple of Jupiter, the great father of God of Rome, who ruled heaven with his thunderbolts and nourished the earth with his fertilizing rains. If it was a It belonged to Jupiter if it was a capital. And his priests, Jupiter's mascot was the eagle, which the founding fathers, the United States, made their mascot as well, the eagle. Consider, quote, folks, here, quote, here's another one. The land known today as the District of Columbia bore the name of Rome in 1663. Property records and a branch of the Potomac River that bordered Rome on the south was called the Tiber. That's the river in Rome. This information was reported in the 1902 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia's article on Daniel Carroll. The article specifically declaring itself, quote, of interest to Catholics in the 1902 edition was deleted from the New Catholic Encyclopedia in 1967. Revisionist history. So there you have it. Just some tidbit quotes out of Saussy's book that are quite revealing and should give you a reason to read it if you haven't. And I was just kind of giving you my personal backdrop before this of how I knew both Phelps and Tupper and what I feel about them. And I feel all that information should be out, and no one, in this case, especially Saussy, should have been called what he was, unless there was solid factual evidence, not based on what he uncovered in this book. So, what did I want to get to? There's much more. First of all, if you can go back to some of my shows, you remember the travel agency I wanted to start. And that was, the what should I call it? I don't know. The no, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't get any customers. But anyway, wouldn't it be nice to go on tours like to Rome and to United States and to London and all these places and uncover all these crazy things that you see that are there for the supposed elite? It's their way of communicating and laughing in our faces. For example, did you ever know what was on your Capitol building, Persephone, what she stands for, and why that woman would be there, up on top of our Capitol? And did you know that Abe Lincoln, when that was put up there, did not come out of the White House because he knew what was going on and he understood the Roman power, control over us? And it'd be nice to go through a lot of the architecture and all of the symbols in a travel agency, a tour guide. You pay so much, let's go to Rome, but let's look at what really these things are standing for. Let's go to London, and let's go to the United States. Let's talk about the obelisk. Let's go to the Washington Monument and talk about that, what it really stands for. And do you know it's a symbol of ISIS? Yes. And there's the three major capitals of this triumvirate, Rome, London, and Washington, D.C. have much in common. They have their own flag. One, they sit in the country but are not a part of the country, each of them. London, there's a part of London, they call it London. It's not a part of the city of London or not a part of England. Then we have the Vatican sitting in Rome, not a part of Italy. Then we have Washington, D.C., which is not a part of the United States. They have their own flag. Each of them has the obelisk. And each of them has a purpose in this Jesuit Vatican-led New World Order. America being the military power, London being the financial center and power, and of course, the Vatican being the Luciferian spiritual power directing all of this stuff. Now, out of these three places, this triumvirate of power that wants to take over everything, who would be the natural leader? The one that's been there longest, that knows the most, that has done the most damage under Lucifer. Yes. And whether you believe in God and Lucifer or not, they do. And they believe in a certain power that they can muster, whether it be through bloodletting or through other things, that can basically, solidify their control over your mind, body, and soul. Yes, that is what they do. And it would be great to form a company. We'd probably find things in Amsterdam. We'd probably find things in all over the place leading up to what we're talking on this show. What a great travel agency. I've always wanted to do that. Plus, it gives me a reason to travel. I like traveling. You know, like the guy who did who's that guy who did I miss his show. He committed suicide, they say. Can't think of his name now. But he'd go around to all these different places in the world and would test their food, eat their food. He had a really interesting show. I liked it. Anything to do with food. And all of a sudden he's gone. But, let's fast forward to a travel, let's do a show pointing out all these things. But doing it in a more, once the show's done, or just a travel agency, hell with the show. We'll just take people there, and show them the real signs and symbols of what you're going to. Everybody goes to Washington. Oh, we got to go see the Washington Monument, a symbol of freedom. Oh, we got to go to sit in Vatican Square and pray to God and stand by that obelisk. Oh, we got to go to London. It's so beautiful, even when it rains. And let's tell them the truth about what their buildings really stand for. And I think it'd be really a good company. How many people would go? I don't know. But anyway, I wanted to end this, but I'm not going to have time. I only got 5 minutes. But we can do this tomorrow, I guess. I always say that and never do it. But isn't that like life? We always say, we'll do it tomorrow. Then you forget about it and do something else. But Tupper ends this interesting. There's a connection, he says, between the mark of Cain, the truth, and what is the true story, and how he interprets it, which, I haven't heard too many. I talked to a lot of Bible scholars over the years, and I talked to a lot of Catholic priests who are not scholars of the Bible, and I talked to a lot of people who aren't scholars, but I did not hear, but for a few people, this interpretation of Cain, the story of Cain and Abel. I always thought it to be a very, one brother killing another, etc., God getting involved here. What the hell did it mean? And so when he came up with this idea, well, I guess he didn't come up with it, but when he put this together, probably from others that he talked to, I really thought it was interesting. And it starts off, and I'll just kind of whet your interest so you come back tomorrow, as they say. We live in a new world order, said Saussy, just as people under Augustus Caesar did. Not a future thing to be feared or avoided, the New World Order, I'll add the Vatican Jesuit New World Order, is a present reality to be identified, understood, and dealt with in a way most pleasing to God. Okay, it was God, after all, who established the New World Order. Makes sense, doesn't it? We never look at it that way. Or can we look at it and say, oh, no, well, Lucifer established it, but God established him, so I guess logically he's right. We can read about it in the Bible. In fact, the Bible is the only, he says, record we have that publicly and truthfully sets forth the essentials of the order's origins and development throughout history. So there's a connection throughout history. That's why the Vatican is so important here. The Bible records the great decisive events in the progress of human life up to the close of the first century A.D., the creation of the earth and the fullness thereof, creation of man and woman, their turning away from God, the first conception, the first birth, the first sacrifice, the first murder, the first insignia, the first city, the first and only great flood, the surviving family, and its peculiar relationship through time with God. All of the momentous data is given in the Bible, with a stark truthfulness that is invariably supported often, to the surprise of many people, like I say, who never read it, if they really look at it, are surprised that it's a historical and political and scientific record as well. And the writers of the Bible, Israelite prophets inspired by their God, Yahweh, held no monopoly on reporting these events. Priests of other nations reported them too. But in doing so, they cunningly adapted them to fit prevailing administrative needs. The results of their adaptations is what we call mythology. Okay? One very present myth, based on the crucial event accounted for in the Bible, explained to people under the Babylonian rulership the divine origin of their government. This was the myth of Marduk. Okay, so we'll start with that tomorrow and talk about the myth of Marduk, and then also talk about how that connects to the story of Cain and Abel, and how the story of Cain and Abel actually connects to the people, the rulers of today, and how this all makes some sense. And it really is something to really think about. Another thing that I mentioned, when you start looking at these kind of things that Saussy's talking about, I found a lot of good information in a lot of the esoteric books written by people like Blavatsky and others who are high up in Freemasonry and the occult. And once you start reading their stuff, you start seeing how all this works together. And they are very insightful. In fact, one of their great writers, so to speak, from their point of view, Manly P. Hall, had kind of backed up what Saussy said about the foundations of America and the connections between the Vatican and the foundations, as well as one of our famous historical figures, Mr. Thompson, who was the transcriber of all of these meetings when the country was formed and was known as the Man of Truth. He, in fact, backed it up as well. Some things that never get talked about. Well, God willing, the creek don't rise. Like I said earlier, we will be back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Have a good evening, and see you, as they say, tomorrow.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.